Texas Panhandle, spring 1944. Dust whipped over the barbed wire fence as a battered GMC truck rolled to a stop, its engine popping like a dying cough. 40 pairs of boots hit the dry soil, followed by silence. That kind of silence that doesn't come from peace, but from uncertainty. Inside the enclosure, the camp commandant, an older Texan with deep crow's feet etched from decades under the sun, adjusted his campaign hat and spat once into the dirt. "Welcome to Camp Hereford," he drawled. "Don't try anything stupid. You'll find we're not like the guards back in Europe. We're worse if we have to be. But if you follow the rules, well, you just might learn something about being a man." The prisoners, Wehrmacht infantry from North Africa and Sicily campaigns, stood shoulder to shoulder. Most were young. Most still wore the disbelief of surrender like a stain on their uniforms. The youngest, Eugen Bauer, barely 20, son of a Berlin baker, scanned the distant horizon. He'd expected punishment, labor camps, humiliation. What he didn't expect was the lone rider approaching across the prairie. A single man on a tall, sorrel horse rode straight toward them from the west. From the distance, it looked like something out of a movie reel. Wide-brimmed hat, relaxed gait, a rope coiled on the saddle horn. For a brief moment, Eugen mistook the man for a mounted guard, maybe even part of the welcome committee. But as the rider drew closer, it became clear this man wasn't military. He was something else. The first thing they noticed wasn't the horse, but the sound. A strange, rhythmic jingle like distant sleigh bells. The men looked to the sky, then around the truck. Finally, they realized it came from the man's spurs. With every shift of his heel in the stirrup, the rowels sang like wind chimes. "What is this?" one POW muttered in German. "Is this a show?" The rider slowed to a trot just past the fence. He looked down at them. "Which one of y'all ever been on a horse?" he asked, southern drawl thick and unbothered. Not a single hand went up. He grinned. "Then I reckon we got ourselves a project." Camp Hereford wasn't just a prison. It was a strange fusion of barbed wire, cattle pens, and mesquite trees, backed by rolling fields that seemed to stretch forever. The POWs were shocked by the food, real meat 3 times a week, milk, white bread. But even more confusing was the work detail. There were no factories, no railroads, just ranches. The next morning, 12 prisoners were marched, without chains, onto a neighboring cattle spread owned by an old cowboy named Hank Colton. Age 60, skin like weathered leather, voice like gravel in a tin can. And when the guards left them there and drove off, the Germans looked at one another, stunned. "Are we supposed to escape?" whispered Heinz, a lanky Bavarian who'd once operated artillery in Tunisia. "No," Eugen said, eyes fixed on the paddock ahead. "They want us to work, look." 4 horses stood tied to the rail. Big, muscular, restless. Beside them, saddles, reins, and a pile of gear the Germans didn't recognize. Hank strode up and dropped a bridle at Eugen's feet. "You want to eat tonight, son. You're gonna learn how to ride." The first attempt was humiliating. Eugen barely managed to swing one leg over before the animal shifted and sent him tumbling backwards into the dust. His ears rang from the thump. The others laughed. Hank didn't. "You lean too far back like that again and he's gonna roll you like a cigarette," he said. "Try again. Loosen your hips. The horse ain't a tank, he's a dance partner." Eugen blinked. He barely spoke English, but he understood dance partner. That was not how Germans thought of animals. Horses were military tools, mounted patrols, supply wagons. This was something strange. 2 hours later, every man had been thrown at least once. 2 were nursing bruised ribs. Heinz swore he'd felt his spine crack in half, but not a single one quit. Because the cowboy never raised his voice. He just watched. Then he rode his own horse in a slow circle around them, showing, not telling. In one movement he stepped off, flipped the reins, and the horse stopped so fast it looked trained by magic. "Y'all don't have to be good," he said, taking a drag from a hand-rolled cigarette. "You just got to stop being scared." By week 2, Eugen had learned to mount without falling. By week 3, he could trot without losing balance. But it wasn't the riding that shocked him, it was the freedom. They were led to the ranch at dawn and returned by sunset. No chains, no threats, sometimes no guards. Hank taught them to saddle up, rope hay bales, move small herds of calves. They were fed lunch under a cottonwood tree. Beans, cornbread, coffee. He even gave them nicknames. Stringbean for Heinz, Boots for Eugen, Cranky for the one who never smiled. The German army had taught them to march, shoot, and dig trenches, but no one had ever taught them to trust something. Not an animal, not a stranger, not even themselves. Then came the branding day. The Germans stood back, watching ranch hands work the iron over a fire. The smell of scorched hair hit them like a wave. Several flinched. It smelled too much like war. "Don't look so grim," Hank said, tapping one of them on the chest. "You ever seen a real cowboy do this?" He grabbed the reins of the youngest colt, pressed the red-hot brand to its flank, and held firm as the horse kicked and snorted. Not once did he flinch. When it was done, he gently rubbed the burn with ointment. "Hurts 'em for a minute," he muttered, "but it tells the world who they belong to." Later that night, around a small fire in the work shed, Eugen whispered to Heinz, "He talks like the horse is family." Heinz nodded slowly. "I think in this place, maybe it is." That evening, under a blood-orange Texas sunset, the Germans walked back through the pasture fence, their boots kicking up dirt behind them. No guards met them. No rifles. Just the wind, the stars, and the faint jingle of spurs in their ears. What they didn't know, what they hadn't yet realized, was that the camp was watching, closely, a quiet experiment. One that was about to go much further than just horse riding. They weren't just being tamed. They were being transformed. The next morning, the wind came hard out of the north, and with it came change. A new truck arrived just after dawn, flatbed, painted army olive but caked in ranch dust, and on the back were supplies not intended for guards. 20 new pairs of boots, wide-brimmed straw hats, denim overalls, canvas gloves, and rough-cut flannel shirts. No insignia, no markings, just clothes. Eugen stepped forward when a sergeant grunted and motioned at him. The man tossed him a bundle. It smelled like cedar and dust and something oddly fresh. "Change," the sergeant said flatly, before stepping back into the truck. When the prisoners returned to Hank's ranch that morning, they no longer looked like prisoners. The gray-green Wehrmacht uniforms were gone. In their place, the POWs looked like cowhands from any American Western. The transformation wasn't lost on them. There was a moment of silence as each man looked down at himself, then at the others. Heinz, still adjusting the fit of his wide hat, said what they were all thinking. "We look like Americans." "More like movie extras," muttered another. But Eugen said nothing. He just stared across the corral, where Hank was already waiting beside a line of saddled horses. He saw them, gave a slow nod, and spat again into the dirt. "Let's see if you ride better dressed like humans." By mid-April, it wasn't just about sitting a saddle. The Germans were being taught how to tie knots, bolins, half-hitches, Honda loops, how to repair fences, drive cattle through muddy streams, how to read a steer's body for signs of sickness or injury. Hank barely explained things twice. He didn't need to. They paid attention like their lives depended on it. Because in a way they did. Every mistake had a consequence. Step wrong near a barbed wire fence and you got shredded. Leave a gate unlatched and 200 head could scatter for miles. Misjudge the terrain and your horse could twist a leg, throwing you and maybe killing itself. But the biggest lesson came one afternoon, when a storm rolled in out of nowhere. The sky had been pale blue and clear by noon. By 2 o'clock it was the color of old bruises. Thunder rolled in low and steady, a warning growl from the belly of the sky. The Texans knew what it meant. The Germans did not. "Keep working," said Emil, a former corporal used to taking orders until they turned deadly. But the wind picked up so suddenly it nearly knocked Heinz off his feet. Dust exploded in whirlwinds. Cattle bellowed and stamped. The air turned electric. Then it hit. Lightning split a tree line less than a mile away. A clap of thunder slammed down, so loud the horses jerked and bucked. Eugen's mount reared, screaming, and he barely held on. But Hank was already there, charging on his own mount through the chaos, barking orders like a drill sergeant crossed with a preacher in a hailstorm. "Drive M to the creek bed. Don't let M scatter." The ranch hands moved like dancers, precise, instinctive, fearless. But the Germans, they were thrown into it. One steer broke free and bolted for the tree line. Heinz, despite all logic, kicked his horse forward and gave chase. The others screamed for him to stop. But then he caught it. 2 hands on the reins, hat flying off, eyes wild, he cornered the beast and herded it back. The Americans cheered. Even Hank cracked a grin. By the time the storm passed, the POWs were soaked, blistered, and coughing mud. But every steer was accounted for. No one had run. No one had hidden. When they returned to camp that night, the guards didn't say a word. But the head officer logged something in his clipboard, a long note, with a smile. What followed in the weeks after was something no German had expected. Respect. Not as prisoners, not even as men, but as workers, as riders. One evening, after the branding fire was long extinguished and the whiskey flask passed between the older cowhands, one rancher said, "They ride better than most greenhorns from Abilene." And he meant it. It wasn't long before Hank did something unthinkable. He handed Eugen a rifle. It was an old Winchester .30-30 well-oiled lever action, not military issue, not regulation, just an honest cowboy's tool. He passed it over without ceremony, only a nod. "Coyote's been taking calves," he said. "Ride with me in the morning." Heinz looked like he'd seen a ghost. Emil muttered, "This is a test." But Eugen just turned the rifle in his hands and said, "No, this is trust." The next morning they rode out before sunup. Just the 2 of them. They tracked paw prints across dried creek beds, spotted the remains of a calf torn apart, ribs showing. Hank showed him how to scan the horizon, how to move silently in the saddle, how to brace the butt of the rifle against his shoulder before squeezing the trigger slow, like letting go of a secret. They didn't spot the coyote that day, but when they rode back into camp, nothing had changed. No accusations, no missing guards, no punishment. The rifle was returned to its rack. And Eugen's world tilted a little more. There were nights when Eugen lay on his cot and stared at the rafters, trying to put it all into order. Just months ago, he'd been marching through Tunisia, terrified of strafing P-40s. Then came the surrender, the boat, the train, the barbed wire, and now he could ride. He could rope. He could track wild animals across open plains. He was 19 years old, and the enemy had taught him how to be something more than a soldier. They had taught him how to be a man. The real test came in early May. It began with a fence down near the river bend. Nothing dramatic, just a few 100 feet of barbed wire flattened after a bull had panicked. Normally, it'd be a routine fix. But the nearby creek had flooded the night before. The ground was soup. The cattle, confused and spooked, had wandered close to neighboring ranchland. What should have been a 2-hour job became a full-day ordeal. By late afternoon, the sun was hammering down. The mud was thick as cement. One of the American ranch hands, a man named Dale, slipped while pulling a fence post and twisted his knee so badly he couldn't stand. The guard radioed the camp for help. But it was Eugen who stepped forward and said, "Let me ride." The guard blinked. "You'll run." Eugen shook his head. If I run, you shoot, but if I don't ride, he doesn't get help. The pause that followed was long, the kind that stretches eternity across a few heartbeats. Then the guard tossed him the reins. Go! He rode like fire across that prairie. Hooves pounding, dust kicking, breath ragged. The sun stabbed into his eyes, but he didn't blink. He knew the trail now. He knew every rock, every dip in the land. He wasn't just following a path, he was the path. 35 minutes later, the truck rolled out from Camp Hereford. Dale was treated. The guard made his report. Eugen was never punished. That night, a radio crackled in the guardhouse. Somewhere up the chain, someone had taken notice. POW integration trial, progressing beyond projections. Behavioral shift visible in subject group, cooperative without coercion. Next phase, full immersion. 2 weeks later, the fencing was gone. Not all of it, just a section. One long stretch where the pasture bled into open land. The prisoners stood blinking in disbelief. No guard dogs, no watchtowers aimed at them anymore. They could run. They could vanish. But no one did. Instead, they showed up the next morning, on time, boots tied, hats adjusted, ready to ride. Ready to work. Not because they were ordered to, but because they wanted to. Because something had changed. In them. And around them. The Americans had stopped treating them like enemies. And the Germans had stopped acting like them. Summer arrived like a slap to the face. The Texas sun showed no mercy, and neither did the dust, the chiggers, or the rattlesnakes. By June, the hills shimmered in heat waves, and even the horses sweated foam by midday. But the German POWs no longer stumbled or hesitated. Their hands were calloused, their thighs ached from days in the saddle, and their English, rough, clipped, and peppered with curse words picked up from the ranch hands, was improving fast. And somewhere between branding irons and barbed wire, something strange had happened. They'd become cowboys. Not just in skill, in spirit. It came to a head during the cattle drive. Each summer, Colton Ranch moved over 300 head of longhorns across open range to a grazing lease 50 miles northwest. Usually it took 5 hands, 2 wagons, and a week. But this time, Hank decided to do something unheard of. He used prisoners. 5 Germans, no guards. He volunteered to sign their release under work furlough rules, an obscure clause buried in War Department policy, allowing certain low-risk POWs to leave the wire if supervised by civilians. The camp commandant raised an eyebrow. "You're sure they won't bolt?" Hank just spat into the dirt and replied, "I trust my horses less." The morning they rode out, they looked nothing like Axis soldiers. Dusty denim shirts, bedrolls strapped to their saddles, canteens clinking at their hips. Hines had fashioned a neckerchief out of an old army towel. Eugen carried a rope coiled tight at his saddle horn, worn with use. The lead trail boss was a square-jawed Texan named Roy, quiet and sharp-eyed. When asked how he felt about babysitting Germans for a week, he'd shrugged and said, "They ride fine. That's all I care about." They left at sunrise with the cattle lowing, and dust already rising off the herd. The prisoners didn't speak much the first day, too focused. Each man had a job. Eugen flanked the left side. Emil and Hines rotated through the swing. 2 others rode drag, eating dust, watching for stragglers. By the second night, around the chuckwagon fire, things loosened. A ranch hand named Jesse passed around a harmonica. Someone offered canned peaches. Then came a surprise. Roy handed Hines a flask. "Drink." Hines blinked. "You give liquor to prisoners." Roy grinned. "Ain't no prisoners here, just men who know how to ride." They rode through plains lit by lightning bugs and watched storms roll across the horizon like slow gods. One night, coyotes circled close, eyes glowing in the dark. The Germans didn't flinch. Another day, they crossed a river swollen with summer rain, and it was Eugen who guided the cattle across safely, shouting commands in a mix of German and broken cowboy slang. Last move, hup hup. When they reached the leased land on day 5, every steer was accounted for. Roy just nodded and said, "Didn't expect it to go that smooth." To which Hank, who had ridden out to meet them at the grazing camp, replied, "I did." Back at Camp Hereford, word spread. Not rumors. Stories. The Germans had worked a cattle drive. No guards, no fences, no guns. They'd come back willingly. One guard said he'd watched Heinz unload gear and stow his saddle like it belonged to him. Another saw Emil show a new POW how to tie a Honda knot, muttering, "You pull it through the loop, nicht so like this." The boundaries were blurring. Even the other American prisoners, Italian POWs, Japanese-American internees in segregated blocks, heard the stories and shook their heads. "They're turning Germans into cowboys," one had said, "only in Texas." But not everyone approved. A letter arrived from a colonel in Washington. The continued unsupervised exposure of enemy POWs to civilian populations presents risks. The camp must maintain discipline, order, and appropriate separation. The camp commandant, a former artillery captain named Preston, read the memo aloud in his office, sighed, then looked out at the field where Eugen was helping 2 guards build a tack shed. "Damned bureaucrats," he muttered. "The boy can ride better than my own son." Later that month, something unexpected happened. A German transport truck pulled into the camp. It carried 20 new prisoners from Europe, fresh from the surrender in Italy. They were gaunt, bitter, and suspicious. Some still wore blood-stained tunics. Many refused to speak to the Americans. They were placed in the same compound as the ranch-trained men. It did not go well. That night the new arrivals sat in tight knots, muttering in low tones. One of them, Kurt, a former SS non-com, watched Eugen with open disdain. "You smile with these Americans. You wear their clothes. You eat their food like pigs in a pen." Eugen didn't answer at first. "Then I ride their horses." Kurt spat, "You are a clown, a trained dog." Eugen walked over, slow and calm, dirt still on his boots from the cattle pens. He leaned in and said, "I used to follow orders like you. Then I learned how to listen, to men, to animals, to the land." He stared him down, then turned and left. He never raised his voice. And he didn't have to. Tension rose for weeks. The new POWs refused to work. They mocked the riders, called them traitors. But then came the fire. July 3rd. Lightning struck a barn 2 miles from camp, igniting hay and tack and driving horses wild in their stalls. The wind pushed smoke east, toward the neighboring ranches. Flames leapt high. A guard radioed the camp. Help was needed immediately. Without orders, Eugen, Heinz, Emil, and 2 others grabbed buckets, climbed onto their horses, and rode toward the blaze. By the time the army truck arrived with water tanks and shovels, the 5 Germans were already inside the barn, cutting reins loose, herding panicked horses into the field, choking on smoke. They saved every animal. Every single one. Even Hank's prized gelding, which Eugen had led out by hand, soaked shirt tied around its eyes to calm it. The rancher wept openly. That night, a local reporter showed up. He wasn't allowed inside the wire, but he snapped photos from the fence line of Germans in cowboy hats, leading horses, laughing beside ranchers, their faces black with soot but proud. The story hit regional papers within days. From Axis to Allies, Germans learned the cowboy code. Washington grumbled, but they didn't stop it. Because sometimes a picture speaks louder than war. It was around then that Eugen found the letter. He was mucking stalls when the guard handed it to him. No envelope, just a folded sheet, creased and worn. From Berlin. His mother's handwriting. He hadn't seen it in 2 years. The letter was cautious, censored, but there was something in it that made him stop breathing. I heard you are somewhere safe. They say you are in Texas. They say the Americans are feeding you. I cannot imagine such a thing, but if it is true, do not be ashamed to survive. That night he stared at the stars and wept. Hank found him there. Said nothing. Just handed him a flask and walked away. The next morning, the horses needed worming. Back to work. Rope. Saddle. Brush. Ride. August brought the heat of judgment. The land cracked under the sun's weight. Water troughs dried faster than they could be filled. Flies buzzed around every eye, every ear, every open wound. The cottonwoods wilted, and somewhere north, war crimes tribunals were beginning to draft their first letters of inquiry. The war in Europe was drawing to a close, and the men at Camp Hereford knew it. But the future had never been more unclear. Would they be returned to Germany, to nothing? Would they be kept as laborers? Would they be tried, executed? Some didn't speak of it at all. Others, like Kurt, the SS man, began to whisper again. You'll see, he told Eugen one day by the horse trough. This is just a trick. They make you soft, and then when the war is over, they throw you away. Eugen didn't reply. He simply walked into the stable, grabbed a brush, and began working the sweat out of his horse's coat with long, practiced strokes. He stood by the fence, arms draped over the wood rail, staring out at the open land he once feared to walk without a guard. Now it felt like part of him. Behind him, voices gathered. They say transport begins next month. By ship, East Coast first, then Europe. Do they even know where to send us? The borders don't exist anymore. Eugen didn't turn around. He watched a dust devil twist lazily across the field and thought, I've changed more in 6 months here than I did in 6 years in Germany. And then the camp commandant called a meeting. It was the first time the Germans had gathered in the recreation hall without being ordered. Word had spread fast. A meeting. Important. The war is over. Hank was there too. He leaned against the far wall, hat in hand, boots dusted as always. Not a prisoner, not a soldier, just a man watching a room full of others who'd all become something new. The commandant, Preston, cleared his throat. He didn't wear a sidearm anymore. No need. Men, he began, the Third Reich has officially surrendered. The war in Europe is over. For some of you that means release. For others it means limbo. Will be processing by name, by rank, and by affiliation. Expect paperwork, interrogation, screening. He looked over the group, his eyes pausing briefly on Eugen, Heinz, Emil. But until then, he continued, you'll be treated as you've been treated, by how you behave, not what patch you used to wear. A pause, then a nod. That is all. But as he turned to leave, Hank stepped forward. Hold on. All eyes turned. Hank looked directly at the Germans, then raised his voice just enough to be heard. These boys, he said, ain't just labor. They've ridden through floods, driven herds, pulled colts from breach, fought fires, and earned scars. He pointed at Heinz. This one nearly drowned pulling a steer out of quickmud. Then at Eugen. This one broke his hand, splinting a fence in the middle of a storm. Then he looked at all of them. I don't care what country you came from. You worked like men, you earned your hats, and that means something to me. There was silence. Then someone clapped. Another followed. And then a wave of it, rising from American guards and German prisoners alike. Not because it was expected, but because it was true. 2 days later, repatriation began. 1 truckload at a time. Heinz was called first. He tried not to cry when Hank shook his hand. "You ever come back this way," Hank said, "you'll have a job." Then he tossed him a piece of paper, folded. "What's this?" "My address, Amarillo." Hines nodded, stuffed it in his boot, and climbed into the truck. Emma went next. Then the quiet one who used to dream in French. Each one left behind a bundle of clothes, a saddle polished too many times, a horse that sniffed the fence and waited for them each morning. Eugen was among the last. The night before his departure, he found himself in the stable. The moonlight cut through the rafters like pale knives, silvering the dust motes and casting long shadows. He brushed his horse slowly. The same horse he'd first met half a year ago, wild-eyed, nervous, almost impossible to ride. Now the animal leaned into him. Trusted him. When he finished brushing, he leaned his forehead against the horse's neck and whispered in German, "Thank you." Then again in English, "Thank you." A bootstep echoed behind him. He turned. "Hank." He didn't speak, just stood there a long moment watching. Then he walked over and held something out. It was a pair of spurs. Worn but polished. Not regulation, not army issue. Cowboy spurs. "I can't," Eugen said, almost choking. "You can," Hank replied. "You earned 'em." Eugen took them in trembling hands. They felt heavier than iron. The morning came too fast. Eugen stood by the truck, bag slung over his shoulder, the camp now unfamiliar in its finality. The guards nodded. One saluted. And then from the far side of the field, a dust trail. A horse. Rider mounted. It was Hank. Riding hard. He pulled up fast, dismounted, and handed Eugen a folded paper. Eugen opened it. A photo. Black and white. Faded already. It showed 6 German POWs on horseback. Smiling. Dusty. Free in the only way men could be, when the past was behind them, and the land in front of them didn't care what uniform they'd worn. Eugen looked up. "What should I tell them?" he asked. "Back home." Hank nodded. "Tell 'em," he said, drawing himself up tall, "that when the war ended you rode out like a man." The truck pulled away. Dust rose. The wire fence vanished behind them. And Texas stretched out on all sides. As Eugen sat in the back, wind in his face, the spurs clinked quietly in his bag. He looked down at his hands. Calloused, cracked, dirty. But steady. Strong. American dirt still beneath his fingernails. And behind his eyes, that first morning he'd seen a man ride alone across an open field with spurs that sang like sleigh bells. That's when everything had changed. That's when he'd realized. He hadn't been captured by enemies. He'd been rescued by cowboys.